I saw even with my own kids that like when I was a kid, probably the time between 13 and 15 was the most difficult transition. But I saw that become older. By the time my kids are 30 now, basically. By the time my kids were young adults, I could see that transition into adulthood was the place where the difficulties were starting to mount. I think perversely that the therapeutic world has a fair bit to do with this, partly because therapists who are basically secular liberal Protestants, that's a good way of thinking about them, tend to conceptualize mental health as subjective, right? It's like mental health is something you carry around in your head, like you carry around your identity. That's why we have these ridiculous ideas that you can just define your own identity. I am whoever I say I am. Well, obviously you're not, because other people have to go along with your game there, buddy. And they're either going to do that, they're not going to do it, or they're going to do it voluntarily, or they're going to do it by force. If they're not going to do it, you're screwed. If you have to use force, that's not going to work. And if you want them to do it voluntarily, then it's not going to be all about you. Obviously, even no 4-year-old can find someone to play with if he always gets to pick the game. Okay, so why might young adults be lost? Well, part of it is that they're thinking, I'm not trying to be judgmental of a whole generation. It's a form of thought. Your mental health isn't dependent on you. That's not the right way to think about it. I don't think you can be mentally healthy in the absence of a long-term stable relationship. So you have to be married. Let's make that part of the precondition for successful adaptation as a young adult. You have to be married. So you have to establish a relationship with someone that integrates sexuality, that's there for the long run. Because there for the long run is the same as sane. There for tomorrow, there for the next minute, that's not sanity, that's impulsiveness. That's aimlessness. They're the same thing. If it's all about what you want right now, or more accurately, all about what something in you wants this moment, that's the definition of immature insanity. You have to commit. So you commit to someone else, you commit to your family, you commit to your community. Like, there are multiple levels of identity that stretch out into the social world. And voluntarily adopting those levels of hierarchical responsibility gives you an identity. It gives you a purpose. It protects you from anxiety. It does that in all sorts of ways. Like, you said earlier that one of the things you do is seek for validation, and you related that to uncomfortable experiences you had when you were very young. Well, it might not be precisely that you're seeking for validation. You might be properly investigating how you should be embedded in a social hierarchy at every possible level. It's like, well, people think their mental health is something that they just carry around in their head, and that if they just got the way they looked at the world right, or if other people just played their game, that all of a sudden they'd be mentally healthy. It's like, there's no difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable. Technically, if you look at, you can group descriptive statements about yourself statistically. All the descriptors that are reflective of self-consciousness load on negative emotion.
Can you not think about yourself in a positive way?
Probably not.
Really?
Not. Well, let's take that apart. You like doing your podcast and you feel positive about it. Okay, but your podcast isn't about you, right? So if you're thinking about how you're of utility to a broad number of people, maybe you would take some satisfaction in that, but that isn't exactly thinking about yourself, is it? It's thinking about the relationship you've established with other people, and it's a relationship of responsibility. Why do you like your podcast? You can pursue what you're curious about, but you wouldn't have to do that publicly. Okay, so why do you do it publicly?
For a few reasons. First one being that it keeps me accountable. That was one of the main reasons, that it kept me accountable, because I knew that if I didn't do it, if I wasn't rigorous and precise and aligned with what I'd said and done previously, that there was an external eye that's watching.
Okay. So, well, that's very interesting. So I would also say that's not exactly about you. That's about your ability to live, to establish harmony between what you say and the way you act, and the expectations that an increasingly broad social community has of you as a consequence of what you say and how you act. Okay, that's not about you. That's about your nesting in a social hierarchy, right? And so I think you can, and then you might say too, well, maybe you're thinking about yourself when you're establishing an aim or a goal. Well, not if they're good aims or goals, because if they're good aims or goals, and I would say what good means technically is an aim or goal that will play out well in the medium to long term across a multitude of situations, including many, many people. So a solution that iterates across time, that is situation independent and that's broadly socially inclusive, is a better aim, right? It's a higher aim because it integrates more. All right. Now, you might want to be setting up aims, and you might be pleased about how you're progressing in relation to those aims. But if those aims don't have the characteristics that I just described, then if the aims have the characteristics I just described, they're not about you. And then we could also ask, what do you mean about you? Exactly. What you are you talking about here? And so we play these identity games in the modern world that are making people anxious and hopeless. And one identity game is, I'm defined by my sexuality. Okay, so let's take that. I'm defined by my sexuality. Okay, but what do you mean by your sexuality exactly? Do you mean the opportunity to engage in sex? Like, are you reducing sexuality as such to the act of sex? Okay, let's say you are. So now what you're telling me is that who you are is who you are when you're sexually desirous. That's what you've reduced yourself to. But it's even more than that. It's the kind of sexual desire that wants gratification right now with no relationship whatsoever. So not only have you now reduced who you are to your sexual desire, you've reduced your sexual desire to the minimal set of preconditions that would satisfy it. Well, then the first question that might come up there is, why not just use porn? It's a lot simpler. And the answer to that is what people are doing. Well, it's no wonder that they're anxious and lonesome and aimless, because they've reduced themselves to a short-term desire. They've found the easiest possible way of gratifying that, and they've abandoned everything that would be a much broader conceptualization of what sexuality would be if it was embedded properly in, well, how about a relationship to start with? And these aren't just opinions. So there are two different strategies of reproduction broadly in the animal world. One is zero investment. Fish, mosquitoes, million offspring, they all die but one, right? So you can reduce reproduction in mosquitoes basically to sex. And you make a million mosquito offspring, all you need is one to survive, problem solved. Okay. On the opposite end of the spectrum, literally, are human beings, because we have the longest dependency period of any animal by a large margin. We have a high investment strategy, sexual reproduction strategy. So whatever sex is for human beings isn't you're off and that's over. That's not what it is for human beings. It's embedded in a relationship. Now, you might say, well, we could pull sexuality out of the relationship and just indulge in it for the pleasure. Okay, so now let's forget about all the other animals. Now we've got two types of human being. We've got the one-night stand human being, repetitive one-night stands, and we've got the long-term committed relationship human being. And then we might ask, okay, what are the personality characteristics of the people in those bins? So let's go to the short-term one-night stand sequential relationship types. Okay, who are they? Psychopathic, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and sadistic.
All one-night stand people?
If they don't start out that way, they're going to end that way. Right? Because you can't use yourself or other people for short-term gratification. Look, the definition of a psychopath is someone who uses someone for short-term gratification. Okay, so it's definitional, right? So, and then you might say, well, I'm not like that. I just like sex. It's like, yeah, but if you practice that for 5 years, you're not going to become what you practice. And I talked to Russell Brand about this a little bit and I can say this because it was on his podcast, so it's not like this is secret. Russell had what Andrew Tate promises his followers. He had fame, he was charismatic, and he had more or less unlimited access to short-term sexual gratification. Okay, in combination with, the chemicals that make that even more likely, alcohol and cocaine, let's say. So what are the consequences? Well, I asked him, what were the consequences? You had this. He said, despair, anxiety, and hopelessness. Right, but not just that, because, Russell got himself in trouble here a month and a half ago, just about took him out. Well, it was his past coming back to haunt him, and he had to scroll through his psyche and see, with all these short-term relationships, these short-term sexual gratification binges that I indulged in, did I ever cross the line? Well, the answer is, you're going to have like 200 encounters like that, and you're not going to cross the line. When you're drunk, when you're on cocaine, you're going to cross a bunch of lines. And then it's going to come back and haunt you. And so it's very interesting to see in our culture, back to the hopelessness and despair that you were mentioning that's characterizing young adults' life. It's like, it's all about me. That's the self-esteem movement. But then me becomes, it's all about what I want. And then that becomes, it's all about what I want right now. Then it's what the lowest part of me wants right now, and to hell with everyone else. It's like, okay, how are you going to play that game without being desperate? You're going to be desperate as soon as you start playing that game. And the other thing, it's even worse than that, because you're going to end up with Jeremy, the porn star problem. You're not going to be very happy about being with the people who want to play that game with you, because they're not going to be the people that are really going to make you feel that life is worth living. They're going to be the people, especially on the female side, women who are willing to take advantage of themselves for short-term sexual gratification. Those aren't happy women. They're usually damaged women. And if they're not damaged when they start playing that game, they're going to be plenty damaged by the time they're done with it.